I like the wide spectrum that it covers, from the myths about Pisgah to the technological aspect to the view from the Biltmore House.
The whole dimensionality of the piece is just wonderful.
I think that he captures very well Mount Pisgah's relationship with the library and also the environment's relationship with Mount Pisgah.
Every time I look at that, I see something new. I never noticed the feather that was in number 5.
You can look at it and have just a general impression, but as you look longer and deeper, you see the layers that unfold.
Welcome to the D. Hayden Ramsey Library. I'm Mel Blowers, the University Librarian. We're delighted to have you here this evening for this special occasion. Ramsey Library was designed to be more than a collection of books, designed to be a house for art, and we have two gallery areas here in the library. We have a collection of museum pieces and artwork, and we have always have moving exhibits. But Robert Johnson has set for us a new standard of permanent artwork in the library. We're delighted. The project began in the winter of 1975, and Tracey Penn Rogers, who was the project manager for the North Carolina Arts Council, is with us this evening. She's going to tell us a bit about the process, and she's going to introduce Robert Johnson, who will tell us some stories about his artwork.
I'm very happy to be here and to be representing the North Carolina Arts Council Artworks for State Building program tonight. In 1988, through the guidance of the now retired Representative Marie Colton of Asheville, the state introduced a funding mechanism for the inclusion of art in new or renovated state buildings. And this mural is one of the 53 artworks that has been made available to citizens through this process. The program was eliminated by the legislature in 1995, but I am happy to report that I just found out a bill has been introduced this session to reinstate the program. Thank you. Robert Johnson was selected for this project by a panel of UNCA campus representatives and the building's designer, who is Roger Leeson. But from the campus, Mel Blowers and Tucker Cook, Ron Reagan, Robert Tynes, Elma Johnson, along with ex officios Ellie Marsh, Sherry Medling, and student Jason Watson, met numerous times for long hours to review the artist proposals that had come in on this project, and spent much time deliberating over which artist would create the most appropriate and outstanding work for the library. Robert lives in Burnsville, North Carolina. He received an MFA, Master of Fine Arts, from Mills College in Oakland, California in 1970, and he went to Italy in 1980 to study egg tempera painting and fresco painting. He's received several grants over the past few years in recognition of his work. In 1991 and 1994, he received artist project grants from the North Carolina Arts Council. And in 1994, he also received a Southern Arts Federation Award for his painting. He has most recently received a North Carolina Artist Fellowship, which is very exciting. He's going to travel to South America to retrace the steps of American landscape painter Frederick Church, so I'm very anxious to see the fruits of that. Roberts is known for his studies and his paintings of landscapes in North Carolina parks, and we are so pleased to have one of his works in the state's public art collection. Let me introduce you to Robert Johnson.
Well, hopefully you all were wondering what the heck is going on up here, and with all these strange images and a lot of stuff going on. Well, let me tell you how this particular mural came about. Actually, my work tends to be very narrative. In other words, I like to tell stories in my paintings, which is, I think, very appropriate for the library. So I didn't hold back on the narrative part of it for the library. They all have stories connected with them. And I wanted to put a lot of detail in there. When I came into the library one day, it was very crowded. This is the reference desk. There was a line of people waiting to talk to someone at the reference desk. I wanted to offer something that people could look at so they wouldn't be bored standing in line while they're waiting to get their reference material looked up. So I wanted to put a lot of stuff in there that would entertain as well as just have something pretty to look at in the library. Hopefully the mural can be taken on several levels. First of all, just as pretty pictures. They're nice colors, they're flowers, they're nice nature scenes, and if you can come in and look at it, if you look at it quickly, hopefully you'll enjoy it on that level as nicely decorative. But there's a lot more going on in there too. And the idea that evolved stems from my I've done murals in houses and public buildings and so forth, and one of my real interests is in the natural environment in all my work. It's kind of how people relate to the natural environment, and one of my interests was to see how this library related to the natural environment. And the one feature of the natural environment that this library relates to the most is Mount Pisgah. I'm sure you've noticed as you walk out the front door, you look right over the quadrangle and you see this ridge line there, and Mount Pisgah is the dominant mountain that's right there. And obviously when the architect situated the building and thought of it, put it up on this sort of platform, that looking out at Mount Pisgah and that view was very important to the library. So I wanted to emphasize that connection with Mount Pisgah and the library. So and that's what you see behind there. Essentially what the silhouette behind there is what you see when you look out the library. It's kind of like bringing the outside inside and connecting the site with the building and its environment. So I started reading about Mount Pisgah and, why is it called Mount Pisgah? I found out that Mount Pisgah is actually named after Mount Pisgah in the Bible. Mount Pisgah in the Bible is where Moses stood and he saw the promised land. Of course, he never got into the promised land, but he stood up there and looked into the promised land, essentially in the area, this was like the future of his people. And so it got me in mind of thinking about the future and all of these different visions of the future that are floating around in our culture. And I thought I'd try to gather those together in some sort of orderly kind of way. And so I did a lot of reading and investigating, talking to a lot of people. And I ended up kind of seeing that, in my mind anyway, there were like 8 fairly distinct different visions of the future. And I wanted to tie it to Mount Pisgah so that Mount Pisgah is, of course, a national forest right now. And so the idea is each one of these represents a vision of the future and how that future would affect an area like Mount Pisgah. In other words, a beautiful natural area like Mount Pisgah, what would that look like? And sort of in my fantasy kind of way, each one of these is like a different vision. And I came to find out it's not essentially a political diatribe that I'm trying to get across here of what that future should look like. In all these different visions of the future, there are like positive and negative elements of it. And let me just go through them fairly quickly is really what I wanted to do tonight. Let's start at the left. That's where we start. And I think if you look closely, you'll notice that there are 2 panels that represent the summer, 2 panels that represent fall, 2 that represent winter, and 2 that represent spring. So we go through the year that way. The summer panels are sort of a vision of the future that kind of what's happening now, is sort of the current use of natural areas that's happening now. The first one is government managed multiple use. Essentially that's what's happening right now to Mount Pisgah. It's managed by the Forest Service, which is a government agency, and the idea of the government managing it, the Forest Service manages it for multiple use. They try to satisfy a whole wide range of uses. So there's a little bit of mining, a little bit of logging, a little bit of mountain bike riding, a little bit of four-wheeling, a little bit of hiking. And I just tried to kind of throw everything in there that was going on. And basically my vision of the future for that is just that there'd be more of what's going on, all this diversity. And, there are real positive elements to that in that it satisfies a lot of different people, but it's all very oriented towards use is sort of the way that people are thinking about it. And, I think it'd be very easy for it to get really overused in lots of different ways. The second vision of the future is another thing that's happening right now that I'm sure you're probably aware of. You probably have friends that have moved to this area because they've been able to bring their jobs with them. And they've been able to bring their jobs because of the information age, and that's what I call the information age future. And they've been able to bring their jobs because they've been able to hook up to their business through computers and through satellite dishes and so forth, and they've been able to do their work there. And nature, an area like Mount Pisgah, then becomes sort of a backdrop for them to do their real work in, which is essentially taking place in cyberspace, which is a whole different relationship to the natural environment that, say, the traditional culture has had around here. It's sort of a backdrop. There's not sort of that real physical connection with nature. And, there's kind of this loss of connection with nature in that sort of lifestyle, but there's also, they want to keep it very aesthetically beautiful. It wants to be kept as a very nice place to live. So it's sort of a positive aspect to that too. The next one is what I call aristocratic future. And there's some people that believe, and that's the fall. My fall futures are very, they're kind of visions of the past. They're like old visions of how to manage a natural area. This one is actually, I don't know if you know this or not, but Mount Pisgah used to be owned by Vanderbilt. And essentially, Vanderbilt owned his view. Everything you could see from Biltmore House, he owned everything. He owned Mount Pisgah, everything between Biltmore House, essentially, and Mount Pisgah. And he had a little hunting lodge up there where he'd go up and spend some time. And there are a certain faction in our society that believes that, we should have sort of this aristocratic upper class that has a lot of money, and that they would buy up huge tracts of land and manage huge tracts of land, which is kind of sad for people that don't have money or aren't connected with it because they don't have access to it. But on the other hand, it's Vanderbilt really managed his land very, very well. He was the first one that he brought over a forester from Germany to do improve foresting timber products practices, and anyway, it's managed quite well, but so there's sort of positive and negative elements to that also. The next one is what I call free enterprise future. And this one is, and there's a certain segment in our society that believes that if the government really shouldn't own land, it should belong to, it should be privately owned and developed for essentially commercial use. And that's essentially what my vision of what Mount Pisgah would look like. And one of the areas that I loved hanging out around up there, up around there, is Graveyard Fields. I'm sure quite a number of you have been there. It's almost like a natural little park, and my vision is that somebody would buy up Graveyard Fields and make a nature park out of it, since it sort of has this almost little natural feel to it, and put in a little golf course and little tubing down the river and stuff. And up on the parkway, it's all just full of billboards and motels and whatever you'd have up there. This is essentially free enterprise without any sort of controls on it, and what that might look like. The next two are pretty grave visions of the future. Those are my winter scenes. The first one is the apocalyptic future. And in doing reading, in our culture, there are basically two strong strands of this sort of apocalyptic view of the future. One comes from fairly fundamentalist religious, whether it's Christian or Islamic or whatever, that there's like going to be this huge apocalypse, and there's going to be earthquakes and lightning, and I got into reading the book of Revelations, so there are a lot of images from the books of Revelations in there, and things are going to fall apart, but there's going to be this new future that's taking place after that, and it's going to be this wonderful place. Now, in that sort of strain of thinking, this new future is going to take place up there, up in heaven, up in the sky, someplace away from Earth. There's this whole other strain, sort of apocalyptic strain of thinking in our culture that I've run into, that's sort of a New Age, sort of Native American-based idea of the future, apocalyptic view, where of Earth changes and so forth, where there are going to be all these dramatic changes in the Earth, and everything's going to fall apart, but things are going to start over again, and there's going to be this wonderful world after that. And but the main difference there is that in that belief that wonderful world is going to take place right here on Earth, and that's what I tried to represent by the feather there. Actually, that's a copy of a Frederick Church painting of from down in Ecuador, but it looked like sort of somebody's vision of what this beautiful, huge natural area would look like. The next one's an interesting one. It's what I call the silver seed future. And actually, I run into this, that there are people in our culture that believe that we don't really have to worry about the natural environment, that we can just let it go, exploit it, use it as much as we can, let it get polluted. The only thing we need to do is when it gets unlivable here on Earth, we'll get in our rocket ships, go off, find another planet, and start all over again. And there's actually sort of a whole body of thought about that I ran into in reading several futurologists and so forth. Sort of an offshoot of this is that you'll go off to another planet to do, you run out of certain minerals on Earth and so forth, and you just do your mining on other planets and bring it back to Earth. And we don't particularly have to worry about our resources on the Earth. Anyway, that's another vision of the future. And then I get into my probably more positive ones that are springtime paintings. The first one is what I call a preservationist future. And this is essentially a vision of the future, probably a vision of the area like Mount Pisgah that's probably espoused by mainstream environmental groups and so forth, like the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, and so forth, that definitely has a lot of real positive aspects to it, which is that an area like Mount Pisgah should be preserved sort of in its most pristine state, and that we should have areas like this in the natural environment that aren't disturbed at all. But then what happens, to the rest of the world, and like down in the valley, here in Asheville, there may be minor changes that take place, but essentially civilization goes on as usual. And I'm representing kind of the contrast between the lady slipper up in the preserved area, which is nice and pristine, and then down in the valley where there's sort of fairly uncontrolled growth and pollution and so forth. Lady slipper's not doing so well down there. So that's sort of, a positive and a negative aspect of that. And then my last one is what I call my deep ecology, eco-feminist future. And it's also tied in with it's tied into the image of the peaceable kingdom, I think is a big part of it. That's where I got a lot of these images from. And it's the idea that it's kind of this very idealized vision of that the Earth's population is reduced by a great amount. The native animals that once lived here have all been brought back, like the buffalo and the elk and so forth. And people are living in harmony with the natural environment. Very, very simply, our material consumption has been cut down. We're doing everything with appropriate technology. There's a little bicycle, a little solar panel up there, and construction's all out of native materials and so forth. And we're living on an equal basis with the nature around us. And it's not a human-centered culture, but one that's centered on the whole the whole ecosystem around us. Sort of on an equal basis. That's probably the most positive vision of the future that I ran across, but it seems very much way off in the distance and not easily achievable anyway. So that basically represents kind of the, from the reading and talking to people, the research that I've done about all these different visions of the future that are kind of floating around in our culture today. And just before I close, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that around on the walls, on the back walls behind you up here, are sketches that I did for these paintings. So if you get a chance, you can look at these sketches, and you'll probably find a lot of images in the sketches that you'll show up in the painting. My working process is basically I just go out with my little sketchbook, watercolor paper and my watercolors, and painting for me is really just an excuse for getting out in the woods. I love being out in the woods. And I go out and I spent most of last fall, a lot of time last fall and summer and in the winter up in the Mount Pisgah area. So I got all these images come from the Mount Pisgah area, and these are my working sketches that I did that I developed the paintings from. So that's essentially the way that I work. I think that's about all I need to say about this. Does anybody have any questions that I can answer right away? Or good. If you have any questions, just come up to me and ask me.
Robert, you've exceeded the expectations of the panel. We're proud to have this work at the heart of the UNCA campus as what I'm sure will be a new benchmark for permanent art on campus.